Congressman Mike Johnson taking time for us a little bit this morning. Hey, Mr. Mike, welcome back to Keel. How are you this morning?
Hey, guys, doing great. Good to be with you.
Well, Mike, let's start here. The emergency declaration, which I think is a pretty good idea, but then the legislation the president signed. Let's start there. Talk me off the ledge. Tell me this is not the worst idea of all time.
Well, look, we definitely have a national emergency at the southern border. I think anybody who looks at the objective facts has to agree with that. It's a humanitarian crisis. It is a national security crisis. And everyone knows, because it's been discussed ad nauseum over the last several months, all the problems we have with dangerous criminals and drugs and human trafficking and all the rest coming over the border. So the president is justified in his action. The statute that allows a president to do this has been used dozens of times over the last several years since it was enacted in 1976, the National Emergencies Act, where Congress gave the president broad authority to do this very thing. I think at the end of the day, the courts will be inclined to uphold it. Probably not the district court in the challenge, probably not the appellate court. But I think the U.S. Supreme Court under Chief Justice Roberts will ultimately uphold it because they're going to look at that statute, they're going to look at the broad authority that's granted there, and they're going to say, well, he had the right to do it. And so the question we have and the concern we've had and said for weeks is, what kind of precedent does this set? And that's the thing that gives us a little heartburn. But as far as the southern border, it's clearly an emergency, and Congress wouldn't act, so I think the president feels like he has to.
100% agree. Now, as far as all this money that is going for taking care of illegal immigrants, for the transportation, for the schooling, for the housing, for the medical care, isn't that sort of like biting off your nose to spite your face, or whatever the cliche is?
It's part of the problem. It's draining the resources of our country. A lot of these illegal immigrants, of course, are taking jobs that would otherwise go to Americans. It has a direct effect on the economy and a direct impact on every single taxpayer in this country. Whether, for political purposes, everyone wants to acknowledge that or not, that is the reality. And so it's an issue that the president campaigned on in 2016. Build the wall was not just a campaign slogan. It was a national priority that a lot of people, a lot of voters in this country recognize is a problem that needs to be addressed. And unfortunately, it's been overly politicized on Capitol Hill. It's ironic that some of our Democrat colleagues who just refuse to give anything on this issue right now were advocates of border security just a couple of years ago, the same people. So, clearly it's become a political football, and that's unfortunate because there are real lives and American safety and pocketbooks at stake in all of this.
Mike, Build the Wall was part of his campaign, but Mexico will pay for it was part of his campaign too.
Yeah, it was. And, if you talk to the White House liaisons, which we do all the time on the Hill, they point out that Mexico is going to pay for it in some way. We haven't yet ratified the USMCA, the new trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. that replaces NAFTA. And, the White House administration make a point that some of the provisions there ultimately, in one way or another, Mexico is going to contribute to this security issue at our border, our mutual border, and they should. So, there's the devil's in the details there, and there's a lot of that yet to be decided. But one way or the other, whomever pays for it, we have to address this crisis. And I think that's what the majority of the people in this country recognize. It's just unfortunate, like I said, that it's turned into this political issue.
But in a town where we have Barksdale, and we're hearing that $3.6 billion of the money is coming from Defense Department's the military construction account, you got to be concerned. Do you know anything yet about the impact on Louisiana and projects we may lose?
I'm deeply concerned about it. I've been losing sleep about this for weeks when it looked like that might be one of the prospects for the spending measures that would be used. And we are going to fight that vigorously if it comes to that, Aaron. I hope it won't. We don't have any details as late as 10 minutes ago when we last checked. We're still awaiting what pot of money is going to be used or proposed to be used under this declaration. But, the president has a couple of different federal statutes that he could point to. Once the emergency declaration is declared, as it has been, then he has to find specific statutory authority to get the resources and the funds he needs. So as you point out, some of that would potentially come out of military construction funding dollars. We have fought tooth and nail for every penny that has been allocated for Barksdale, and we're going to continue to do that. So we'll have to see what develops.
The legislation that it passed both houses of Congress by a voice vote. There wasn't an actual head count. How did you and other members of the Freedom Caucus on both sides feel about that?
In terms of the big spending bill last
week? Yeah.
Well, it was a recorded vote, and I voted no.
Okay.
And I think 109 or so, I think that was the final number, Republicans voted against that. And I made the point on behalf of the 140 members of the Republican Study Committee, roughly, that these are all the conservatives in the House. Many of them, the vast majority of them, voted no because we felt we had to out of conviction, Robert. It was over process as well as content of the bill. The process was broken because they literally filed the final language of the bill at about 1:27 a.m., and we were supposed to vote on it before 9 p.m. the same day. I mean, if you looked at the bill was almost 1,200 pages on its own, and it had 800 pages of footnotes and definitions and subtext. So it was literally impossible to review the details of that, which encompassed almost a quarter of federal discretionary spending for the year. So I'm not going to vote on a bill that I haven't read. I mean, that's the debacle that gave us Obamacare. Let's pass it and see what's in it. So we revolted on that alone, but the content of the bill was really bad as well. It has all sorts of terrible provisions in it, and I'm afraid over the next week or two you're going to be hearing about more and more that was stuffed into that bill that, frankly, no one had a chance to read and review before they voted.
Back to the emergency declaration as we wrap up. It's going to, it would appear, end up in the Supreme Court. They will make the final judgment. You had mentioned that. Does anything happen pertaining to the president's order until the Supreme Court rules? Because who knows how long that could be, right?
Well, that's the interesting thing, Robert, and everybody has to realize that the courts ultimately will have the say on that. I would assume and that there will be a temporary restraining order, some sort of injunction upon the enactment of the order. And while this thing is tied up in the courts, even if it goes to the rocket docket, as we sometimes call it, if it goes on quick review to the Supreme Court, you're talking about probably at least a year and a half at the earliest, be my guess. By that time, it could all be a moot point. I mean, you could have another election cycle. You could have the 2020 presidential election cycle and congressional elections again before a lot of this is ultimately determined by the court. So you could have other actions by the Congress by that time.
At the end of the day, the president is no longer in charge of America. A couple of liberal judges on an appeals court are running the country.
Don't get me started on that. I mean, that's the problem. All of this, at the end of the day, the great concern we have is the separation of powers and going back to the original intent of the Constitution and how our republic was framed. And the Supreme Court and the courts were supposed to be the third and least important branch of the government, and now they effectively run every aspect of our lives. The Congress was supposed to have all the rights to make these decisions on spending, raising and spending the people's money, and the executive branch was supposed to do its limited job. Look, all of that's been obscured, and there's a lot of fault to go around, and both parties are at fault. But we need to get back to the original intent of the Constitution, or else we're going to be in jeopardy like this much more in the years and decades ahead.